regulators that talked about the distribution of water.
The gentlewoman's time has far expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Micah.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I think this hearing is going to be known as the Great Finger Pointing, hearing. And we got Flint Mayor throwing people under the bus, with Flint Emergency Manager throwing people under the bus, and we've got Ms. Hedman, former EPA administrator for that area, throwing people under the bus. But somewhere it seems like people were asleep at the tap, not doing their job. Now, if the locals failed, and the mayor failed, and the emergency managers failed, and there were failures there, Mr. Edwards, what role would the federal government have?
They're the last resort. They're the last line of defense. They're the last hope of Flint residents.
And the reason we put EPA together was to protect people, right, in cities and communities and states where they did not act to protect the water of the people, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Were they notified? Well, there's some heroes in this. First, the hero is, and she's here today, is Miss Walters and her family, because they notified the local people and the federal people and everybody they could that they were poisoning their kids. Mr. Del Toro wrote an incredible memo. He acted. He's an Ms. Hedman, wasn't he an EPA official?
He's an EPA scientist.
Yeah, he did a great job. A high schooler could read his memo, which he produced. There's a copy of his memo, June 24th. It tells you the violations of the city. It tells you the incompetence. Then it tells you the poisoning of their children. It's documented. And all the steps and the violations of Flint are listed here. Not just this, but they have a history. They're listed on the back. A high schooler could read this and evaluate it. Now, you got that memo, right, Miss Hedman?
I'm not sure when I got that memo.
Well, but you got it, right? Okay, June. And Mayor, you were aware of this, and you two talked, didn't you? Did you talk to her about this memo,
yes.
Mayor? You did talk to her. But, sir, I went back and checked to see if you talked to your constituent, the woman and family whose kids were being poisoned. We knew this early in 2015. We knew it. They knew it at the end of 2014. We had the test here that proved. And he went in and he tested the pipes. He did everything. The first they said it was the pipes were lead into the house. They were lead. They were plastic. They were PVC. There was no lead in there. So you told her at the library on March 31st you were aware of it. You went to Miss Walters and told you were aware of the situation. You take care of it, right? You do anything. Didn't you tell that to your constituent?
Yes.
She showed up April 2nd, 2015 at your office, and they said you were gone for Easter, but they would be back with her on Monday, right? That's what they told her, I'm telling you, and that's what she told me. Today is what? 2016 March 15th. You haven't been back with her since.
Out there where lead and water problems are covered up, the people are cheating on the sampling, and that climate allowed Flint to occur. It allowed these unethical civil servants at MDQ to claim that there was no problem in the water whatsoever, even when they were breaking federal corrosion control law.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Clay is recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there were numerous red flags that should have led the state to agree to return to the Detroit water system. Bacterial contamination in the water as early as summer 2014, the Legionella outbreak, the astronomical lead readings, in Leanne Walters' home, all of these early signs should have been reason enough to consider returning to a safe water supply. But the response was always the same. It was not in the emergency manager's financial plan for the city to return to the Detroit water system. On January 9, 2015, in response to concerns that had been raised about the safety of Flint's water, Mr. Early, you wrote, and I quote, "Suggestions have been made that the city of Flint should return to using water purchased through the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department. For many reasons, financial and otherwise, the city of Flint can ill afford to switch courses at this point." You also said it is not financially prudent to spend $18 million to purchase water that meets the same DEQ standards as the water now available from the Flint River. Mr. Early, obviously, now we know that the water from the Flint River was not meeting the same standards as water coming from Detroit water. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then, did you consider changing course at any point after serious concerns had been raised about the quality and safety of the river water?
Well, at the time that you referenced, we had already enlisted the aid of another water expert to determine exactly what the causes were. We were trying to diagnose the causes. Again, we were dealing with the issue of coliform, TTHM, E. coli, and other issues. We were not talking about lead at the time. The point is simply this: the city of Flint did not have the money.
Yeah, but sometimes, I mean, look, common sense should take over. The General Motors plant stopped using the water when it started to rust new parts. What would that tell? What would that tell the average person? That means they need to stop drinking it. I mean, come on, is that difficult to determine?
We continue to rely on the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. And until such time as they deemed the water unsafe to drink, we were doing all that we could to manage the contamination and to also make the water accessible and potable.
After that January 15, 2015 letter, a few days later, the director of the Detroit water system sent you a letter offering to reconnect the city of Flint to the Detroit water supply. Why did you reject the director's offer?
I did not do that. I was gone from Flint. I had left Flint by that time that letter came out. That rejection was written by my successor. Again, there were 4 emergency managers during this period. That letter of rejection came from my successor.
Okay, and so it came down to you or your successor trying to save $18 million?
No, it came down to the fact that the city did not have $18 million. They were already paying some of the most exorbitant and the highest water rates in the country. We have litigation pending now from the customers who are fighting the rates for the water, even before the contamination.
Okay, going along with your line of thinking then, when do we say, okay, public health and safety matters, and it's the responsibility of the state of Michigan or the EPA to step in and say, we are endangering lives, we are damaging people for the rest of their lives. And when does that occur?
From day one, sir. From day one.
But you didn't do it.
The issues of lead contamination came out in 2015. They came out after that. The issues we were dealing with in terms of contaminated water were the TTHMs, the E. coli, and the coliform materials that were found in the water. And that was a result of the distribution system age. It was a result of the number of water main breaks that we had at that particular time. I mean, this was a perfect storm for things to happen while we were switching from one water source to another. But we tried to manage those.
Well, I mean, but didn't common sense tell you what General Motors did when they changed the water system that they were using because it was rusting the parts? What did that say to you?
What we were told regarding that situation was because of the raw nature of the machine parts that General Motors was producing, the treatment materials we were putting in to treat the water was indeed having a negative impact on their products. But it did not correlate to a negative impact on consumption of the water, according to the DEQ.
For the record, I have a letter in response signed by Darnell Early rejecting Detroit Water's offer to change back. So make this part of the record, too.
Without objection,
Chairman, I yield back.
And before the gentleman yields back, Mr. Edwards, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to this inquiry as well. Did you have something you wanted to, it sounded like you wanted to, okay. Gentleman yields back. I'm now actually recognized myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Hedman, when did you first know there was a problem about water in Flint?
The first time I was briefed was December of 2014. I was briefed on the TTHM issue, the disinfection byproduct issue. My staff have instructions that when there's a significant violation in a system to bring it to my attention, and they briefed me shortly
So you knew
before.
about it in 2014. When did you have your first conversation with Mayor Walling?
My first conversation about TTHM, about the disinfection byproducts, occurred in late February. He requested a drinking water expert in that area, and I supplied him with an expert from the EPA lab in Cincinnati.
So, Mr. Walling, you went on television in July of 2015 and told everybody that it was safe to drink the water. Mike, did you just do that on your own, or who told you that that was a viable thing to say?
The MDEQ had repeatedly provided assurances that we heard over and over again in our technical advisory meetings, discussions with staff, that the water was meeting the standards, that it was safe to drink.
Did you have a discussion with the EPA?
Dr. Hedman and I spoke around that time after the Del Toro memo was provided.
What did
to
she
media
say?
in Flint. And it was explained to me that that memo was under review, that the scope of the problem was being assessed, and my understanding at the time was this was limited to very particular cases because of what was there for lead service lines and plumbing in individual houses.
Mr. Edwards, what's your take on that?
Well, the email is very clear from Ms. Hedman that she apologized for Mr. Del Toro's memo, and Mr. Walling asked her if there was anything that should be of concern to Flint residents, and she said, frankly, no.
Ms. Hedman, why'd you do that?
I didn't apologize for the memo. I apologized for taking all day to get back to the mayor, and that is because I was out of the office for a medical procedure.
Okay, so that was one day. So,
And in fact, during the entire time period that Dr. Edwards imagines I was covering up data and silencing scientists, I was actually out of the office. I did not return until July 13th. During that time period, my deputy, Bob Kaplan, who Dr. Edwards describes as one of the good guys, was actually in charge of the office.
So, Mr. Edwards, this memo from Mr. Del Toro is pretty comprehensive, is it not? Does it tackle the issue? Does it inform them as to the health of this water?
Yes, it points out that Flint's not being protected by federal law and that public health is in danger.
When should that information have been released?
Had EPA just stayed silent and not apologized for the memo to Mr. Walling and told Mr. Walling that Mr. Del Toro was accurate in what he said, I doubt Mr. Walling would have gone on TV to drink the water and tell Flint residents it was safe.
Is that true, Mr. Walling? Were you talked out of it? I mean, the memo comes out, you're getting inquiries from news organizations, the ACLU and others saying, hey, what are you doing about this? And you go on television and say it's safe.
I did trust the guidance that I was receiving, and that's what I regret in this, looking back. But I deliberately reached out. I asked the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs for a point of contact in the EPA. This is while the city of Flint was still under emergency manager, because I wanted to double check on what we were hearing from the state regulators. And when We're hearing essentially the same thing from the state and the federal regulators. Then I relied on that information, and that's what I...
So what did the White House ask you to do? They asked you to communicate with who?
No, I asked the White House for a point of contact, and once
and the White House directed you to?
Dr. Susan Hedman.
And that's where, how long did it take before the EPA finally confirmed, came back and said, yeah, that Del Toro report is accurate? They didn't, did they? They never did. That's the point. You left office, you were there for months and months and months, and they never did come back and actually confirm it. Mr. Edwards, is that correct?
That's correct.
Ms. Hedman, you were in office, you were there being paid by taxpayers until January, late January of 2016. Why did it take you so long?
Mr. Dortal's memo actually dealt with lead at one residence and 2 neighboring residences. And the conclusion of the final version of his memo was that the problem had been caused by physical disturbance of a lead service line, and that it was particular to that household.
Mr. Edwards, this was not a report about one house, was it?
Mr. Del Toro clearly pointed out that Flint was not being protected by federal corrosion control laws, period, and that the public health of an entire city was in danger.
This is where you're fundamentally and totally wrong, Ms. Hedman. And if you don't recognize that now, we're in mid-March 2016, and you still don't get it. You still don't get it, and neither does the EPA administrator. You screwed up, and you messed up people's lives.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Del Toro...
No. The audience, please. Ms. Hedman?
Mr. Del Toro was just one of several people at Region 5 who were concerned about the failure to implement corrosion control and had been communicating to MDEQ at higher and higher levels of EPA management.
This information was out there publicly. It had been released. You didn't like it, did you? Did Mr. Del Toro, if somebody released that report, did he do the right thing or not do the right thing?
I don't believe he released the report.
Okay,
I think we need to be clear that there
was that the right thing for that report to go public?
There were 3 reasons why EPA could not release that report.
Hey, what are those?
The first is that it contained personally identifiable information, health information, and that kind of information is not something that we could release. And so before a report is released, that is typically redacted by our Office of Regional
Okay, so a black pen would take 10 seconds or so? Yeah, okay. Keep going.
Secondly, the material in the report included enforcement-sensitive information, and we do not release that to the targets or to the general public. Again, that would have been a redaction issue. And then additionally, there was data in the report that we neither collected nor analyzed, and it needed to go through a kind of standard QA/QC. I directed that that be done as soon as possible. It was my expectation that the report could be finalized and put in a form that could be publicly released before the reporter had to file his story. That was my expectation at the time.
And it took 7 months. Mr. Edwards, your reaction to her comments?
I'm just in disbelief.
My time is well expired. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I was in local government, Mr. Edwards, for 14 years in Virginia. And my point of contact on the environment almost always was the Department of Environmental Quality. I thought you gave a very eloquent, passionate, and suitably outraged opening statement, but you focus on EPA almost exclusively in that statement. But when we actually get to how government works, and what the mechanics of it are, a local government relates first to the DEQ, and the Environmental Protection Agency doesn't run water authorities around the country. It relies on the state DEQ. And I just, I've heard a lot of talk about let's not finger point, but we do need to get to the bottom of this and how it works. And I don't think this is EPA's finest moment. But I, for one, coming from local government for 14 years, am not going to let the